Did you know that the writers of the U.S. Constitution were sworn to secrecy about what happened in the room where it was written? It's one of the most famous documents in the history of the world. It was the start of one of the greatest countries of the modern age, and yet everyone involved in creating it had to remain silent about how they did it for 30 years. Now that seems like a long time now, but back then, the average life expectancy was only 35 to 40 years. That meant most of the people involved in writing the Constitution would be dead before anyone was allowed to even discuss how it was made. That's why almost everything we know about the process of creating the Constitution came from notes that people wrote about it, in particular from James Madison, who's often referred to as the father of the Constitution. Isn't that crazy? All of the laws that the United States are founded on came from a document that was created in secret, and everything we know about it basically came from one guy. So what wild secrets were being kept by all those crusty old men in short pants and tri-cornered hats? Well, it turns out there are a ton of interesting things about the creation of the Constitution, but the secrecy isn't one of them. The reason everyone was told to keep it a strict secret is because that's the only way everyone could be trusted to share their actual feelings and opinions. Everyone in the room could be completely honest because they knew none of it would get out to the general public. I mean, they were planning a document that would build a new nation. There was bound to be some big disagreements, and nobody wants to remember the Constitution as the document that caused Benjamin Franklin to kick Alexander Hamilton in the junk because they disagreed about whether Congress has the right to collect taxes. But speaking of interesting things about the Constitution, did you know that it's the oldest one in the world? It's been around for over 2 centuries, making it the oldest codified constitution in history. Now, what does codified mean? It just means that the Constitution was arranged and organized into a system. Now, there were other constitutions that were around before the US one, like the United Kingdom, but those were just a loosely gathered group of rules that came from a bunch of people at a bunch of different times. The US Constitution was the first one that was designed from beginning to end, approved by all parties, and signed into law in 1787. Well, hang on a second. It wasn't approved by all parties, and in fact it wasn't even signed by all parties. For example, Rhode Island resisted it for a long time. When they eventually did sign, it was 1790, a full 3 years after everyone else did. Honestly, not a great start for a country called the United States. Not only were some of the states not on board, some of the people who actually wrote the Constitution didn't even sign it. Of the 7 men known as the Founding Fathers who helped create the Constitution, 3 of them were no-shows for the actual signing. Thomas Jefferson was off in Paris trying to get a good deal on the Louisiana Purchase that would make the United States even bigger. John Adams was the ambassador to the UK at the time, a job that probably wasn't super fun since they were the ones America had just fought to get their independence from. And then there was James Monroe, who basically just had other things he wanted to do more. But you know who did show up to sign it? Benjamin Franklin, in a chair that had to be carried into the convention hall. At the time, Franklin was a ripe old 81 years of age, more than double the average lifespan of the time. He was pretty weak and he couldn't walk very well, but he wasn't going to let that stop him from getting there and signing his name to the most impactful document that would ever be written in this country. So suck on that, James Monroe. And speaking of sucking, you know what sucks? Trying to make an amendment to the Constitution. Of the hundreds of constitutions written across the world, the US is by far the hardest one to make amendments to. Check out this math. There have been 11,770 proposals for amendments in US history, and guess how many have become amendments? 27 of them. That's less than 1/4 of 1% of proposed amendments making it into the Constitution. And it's because the process is such a huge challenge to overcome. It has to win a 2/3 majority vote in both the Senate and the House of Representatives, and once that's done, 3/4 of the states have to ratify the amendment. Now, if that sounds complicated and difficult and confusing, it kind of is. In fact, the last time an amendment was actually added to the Constitution was about how Congress members get raises. Surprise. It was passed in 1992, nearly 35 years ago. And if that sounds like a long time since it was passed, guess how long since the amendment was first proposed? 1789. It literally took 203 years for that amendment to make the cut. Now, it gets even stranger because one of the constitutional amendments literally only exists to cancel out another one of the amendments. That's right, the 18th Amendment was passed in 1919, and it made alcohol illegal in the United States. That turned out to be an incredibly stupid and unpopular amendment, but since the process for removing an amendment is even more complicated than creating one, believe it or not, they just decided to pass the 21st Amendment in 1933 to get rid of the 18th Amendment. So technically, while there are 27 total amendments, 2 of them cancel each other out, which basically means there are just 25 of them. Now, if all of these processes sound complicated and annoying and difficult to navigate, that's mostly on purpose. Because here's the big secret about the people who wrote the original Constitution. While they were definitely trying to create a system better than the one that they were stuck with from the King of England, they didn't actually want a total democracy. And that's not an opinion. There's literally no mention of the word democracy in the Constitution. That's because the Founding Fathers had a little more in common with the royal family than they would like to admit. They felt that if the United States was a completely democratic nation, it would lead to mob rule. That's why they landed on a republic, which is the system where people in various states appoint representatives that represent them. That way, the people vote a representative in, and the representative is the one who creates the laws and votes on things. Now that sounds like a lot of drama and complication for a 4-page document. But actually, did you know that it's not 4 pages long, as most people think? It's 5. The 5th page of the Constitution is what's called the transmittal page. It has George Washington's signature on it, along with the official ratification and details on how the Constitution will be put into effect. Basically, it's the instruction manual for the Constitution. But because it's basically just a page with a signature on it and a series of details on how to make it work without any cool quotes, nobody really talks about it that much. Reading the 5th page of the Constitution is kind of like meeting a celebrity's brother. It's cool that it exists, but it's definitely not the thing that gets the most attention. And hey, speaking of cool quotes, did you know that one of the coolest quotes in the Constitution was a late addition that was almost never in there? That's right. The phrase, "we the people," was added right at the end of the process because the founders wanted to clearly establish that the rights and power discussed in the Constitution came directly from the people of the country. It wasn't about royal bloodlines or palace intrigue or who had the most money. The Constitution was intended to represent the common interests of the entire population of the United States. But it's important to remember that nothing is perfect, and that definitely includes the Constitution. For one thing, it didn't make clear what the requirements were for the right to vote. And that's why for a long time, the only ones eligible were land-owning white men. Women were excluded, and black people weren't even considered citizens. And as long as we're pointing out imperfections, a smaller one is that the Constitution also left out one of the N's in Pennsylvania. In other words, there's always room to grow and to get better, and maybe to add that extra N back into Pennsylvania. Oh, and by the way, if you enjoy your Thanksgiving holiday, where you and your family stuff your faces full of turkey and mashed potatoes, remember that the only reason the holiday exists is because back in November of 1789, President George Washington established the first National Day of Thanksgiving in order to give thanks for the new Constitution. So there you have it. A dozen old men who looked a lot like the guys who sit on the rocking chairs out front of a Cracker Barrel got together and created one of the most enduring legal documents of all time. The world of the law is crazier than you could ever imagine. If you want to see more videos about the hidden secrets of the law, be sure to like and subscribe. That's it for this episode of No Way That's Legal. We'll see you next time.